Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to this session of Kathmandu Triennale's Kurakani. This session will bear a common thread of hybridities and the amalgamation of visual references in vernacular cultures, highlighting lineages that transverse and are at times affected by dominant discourses. Yeewan's work asks how can we rethink of the history of Chinese ink painting disrupts the false neutrality of survey courses and its relationship with modernity and its fables of progress. While Zi Hao builds on his work on the Makara skeleton to explore chimeras and composite creatures on creatures in other manifestations, and Sedon reflects on a personal history growing up around Tibetan furnitures, tracing its motifs, symbols, and foreign and regional influences. So our first speaker is Dr. Yeewan Koon. Um, I'd like to welcome her. One is associate professor and chair at the Department of Art History at University of Hong Kong. She has published numerous work, including Nara Yoshitomo 2020, a Chinese Canton painting, The Local in Export Art 2019, and a different cross Surin San, if I'm correct in pronunciation, and the politics of painting in 19th century Guangdong 2014. Kung also worked in the contemporary art field as a critique and curator. In 2014, she was guest curator of It Begins with Metamorphosis Zoo Wing at Asian Society Hong Kong Center, and was one of the selected curator for 12th Guangzhou Biennale in 2018. In June 2021, she curated exhibition So Long, Thanks Again for the Fish, which was part of the inspired program of inaugural Helsinki Biennale in Finland. Dr. Kung, I'd like to welcome you, and the stage is yours.
Hi, hello. It's nice to meet everyone here. Thank you for the invitation. Let me share my screen as I'm doing this. I should start that when Cosmin first approached me to do a paper for this particular project, I thought he was actually kidding. He wanted me to do a paper on a talk that I had given on 16th and 18th century gardens, representation of gardens covering the Ming and Qing dynasty. And I took that as an opportunity to expand it onto larger issues, as you will see. So all of this is to say that my presentation today is going to be coming from the left field, but being from the left field is perhaps where my work can best meet the Triennale's own goals itself. I'm going to be talking about how certain paintings were counterpoints to dominant narratives of Chinese art and gardens. I'm using Edward Said's use of the term counterpoint, which he described, and I'm going to quote here, as offering a simultaneous awareness both of the metropolitan history that is narrated and of those other histories against which and together with which the dominating discourse acts. It is the co-presence of histories that is useful here. It suggests the need to think of how histories, even when running in parallel, complement and compete in ways that register the relevance of others. Now, bubbling beneath all of this, my presentation, which is really going to be looking at classical Chinese paintings, is how these counterpoints also upend a heteronormative idea of classical Chinese art that dominates the way we teach Chinese art history in classrooms, in survey books, in exhibitions, and which ultimately reaffirms in art history in need of decolonization. So now let me begin with gardens. We all probably have some idea what a Chinese garden may look like. We'll have a lake, a pavilion with pointy eaves, twisty pathways, and giant clusters of rocks. This image of the ideal garden was consolidated in the late 15th century and early 16th century. It was presented as a place where people escaped and indulged in philosophical ponderings on man's relationship with nature. It was a retreat, a place of harmonious social order, and with and a place of cultured creativity, a Chinese Italy. I'm fascinated by the endurance of this Italy that continues into the 21st century. In part, the longevity and worldwide spread of this image was due to Orientalist fantasies of a timeless other. But even if postmodern studies have long stripped away some of the imperialist otherings I'm talking about here, this image has continued, not least now by nation-based driven narratives, some trying to reclaim a centrality by talking of this as ink art, as a form of heritage, creating a different kind of historical timelessness, while others use it as a generalized past with no stakes in the present, complicating the legacies of colonialism. So what I want to do here is use history itself to show how even Ming and Qing artists provided counterpoints to this idolized image, essentially exposing gardens as a form of cultural elitism, even as they troubled this history or this story. The garden is intimately connected to the scholar gentleman, China's ideal artist, with his highbrowed cultural pursuits, who was part of a social class of people who were determining what was good taste. This was a world of privilege where owning, seeing, and making art created social networks, largely by men and for men. Gardens were important because it provided a place where these activities can take place. But gardens are also properties, and properties mean money. One of the things that paintings and everything that is connected with it can do is it concocted a cultural world untainted by money that mitigated this problem of ownership. You can see it here in the naming of this garden. But how humble is the possession of a garden as beautiful as this? So what we're really talking about is the performance of social identities, where ownership of things had to be calibrated into another form of language that took them outside a circuit of economy. The performance of social identities is deeply embedded in the language of art. This artist, representative of what we think about when we think about classical Chinese art, Wen Zhenming, is using delicate brushwork to create images that are almost bland in comparison to the real place, with no colors on paper and deliberately amateurish. If color was used, it would be, it was usually light washes. The studio, which will be in a garden within the city, is actually relocated here by the artist into a mountain landscape. After all, the enjoyment of nature is the enjoyment of something that costs nothing, as befitting a scholar who loves art for art and not for wealth. This is actually a painting of a scholarly friend visiting a collector, but there are no obvious display of artworks. The studio is almost bare. It turns the story as friendship of like-minded mind, but this is the thing we need to be in mind of. While this may be about friendship, it is a friendship that can only work if it's told through this elite art practice. As such, there is always an awareness of the problem with possessions and the economic circuits of the art world. This becomes particularly true of this period in time, when this is when the art market in China really expands. There's a booming art market, not only for authentic works, but also for fakes. And then this brings in a question of authenticity of things and of the people who own things, and they all come under scrutiny. And we see this in particular in rock painting, in rock collecting. The scholar's rock is a crucial component of the garden, and collectors are careful to select those that are of interesting shapes, textures, and sense of movement that emphasize the natural energy, the qi that dominates all life force. The rock is a microcosm of the mountain, and in terms of primordial beginnings of nature itself, and you can read it in the essay much more about this nature culture question that is very dominant here. What I'm sharing you here is a story of an artist, of a person called Mi Fu, who was a famous scholar, collector, and artist, who was so enamored with one of these rocks, he treated it as a person, calling him Brother Rock. And he would bow in front of it as an honor, as a demonstration of filial respect to this chunk of stone. This idea that a rock is a living force is evident in this image, where we're in this painting, where the giant boulder agitates with energy of the brushwork, and its looming presence captures the power of the rock that dominates man itself. There are also stories of rocks as steadfast friends, and the extraordinary extent that a person could not part with one's rocks as if it was a lover and could lead to jealousy. Can attachment to things be dangerous? Surely this is the dilemma of the collector. In the late 16th century, one way to circumvent this conundrum of collecting was to claim that collecting was an obsession, P in Chinese. But P in Chinese isn't an obsession in the way that we understand it today. At this particular moment in time, it was defined as a pathological fondness of something. It wasn't, in other words, an illness, a disease. According to one historical text, and this, I'm quoting this now, if digestion stops, the stomach will not work. When one drinks fluid, it will stop from trickling and will not disperse. If this fluid then encounters cold energy, qi, it will accumulate and form a P. This is the same word as obsession. A P is what inclines to one side between the two ribs and sometimes hurts. It's almost in some ways describing a gallstone. And increasingly, this idea of the obsession became used to describe addiction, or as one late Ming scholar wrote, there are people who concentrate on something until it becomes an obsession. When this develops into an illness, knots in the bowels will solidify and form a stone. That P becomes an illness that can transform into an object by becoming petrified and turning into a stone-like substance is what I'm interested in here. It has a transmutable ability that can also extend to humans. And one famous anecdotal story is of a chaste wife who loved her husband so much that one day, despite warnings, after climbing a mountain to gaze back her husband, she turned into stone. She herself became petrified. And it is this idea of P that was applied to the arts at this moment in time. You collect because you cannot help it. You are inflicted by this sickness. And there was a certain cultural cachet to having this obsession. It identified you as being strange or eccentric in a socially acceptable way. But one had to prove that one indeed was sick and not simply pretending to be inflicted. It's this idea of the true connoisseur versus the imposter collector. One is given up one's health for art itself. And we, as I was writing this, I was thinking we can certainly find echoes. I mean, how would this work if we find echoes of this in contemporary art world? This is at the heart of an extraordinary set of paintings that I'm showing here. 10 Views of a Lingbi Rock by an artist known as Wu Bin in the 17th century for a collector called Mi Wenzhong. And Mi Wenzhong wanted a portrait made of his beloved rock. He had a miniature stone that he was obsessed with. And according to his own words, although he had fished this stone out of the lake, it was the stone who sought him out, moving towards him in the waters. Again, the idea of the rock being alive. He asked Wu Bin, this artist who was known for his strange paintings, to make a portrait of this rock. Wu Bin, however, painted not one, but 10 different portraits of the stone, taken from different vantage points. There is nothing like this in Chinese art. The multiple approach to portraiture is an interesting conceit. How can we know the living force, the personality of someone or something through the static approach of depicting only one side of them? Why have one portrait? Can one portrait really tell you what a person is like? Mi's miniature scholar's rock was also meant to be held in one's hand, to feel the cool warmth of the stone, to scrutinize up close the textures, the sense of movement that wraps around this entire rock. The haptic experience is an important part of recognizing the agency of the object, one that can bewilder a man into obsession. And Wu Bin has captured that with his singular pursuit of the surface and the shape of the rock that intensifies as we look at it, as we read through these 10 images. intensifies the idea that this is a highly individualized and special object. This emphasis on the living quality of a piece of rock, where from each position, the rock appears to be a different object, forever changing. We remain fascinated by this change, by this continuous way in which the nature of things or a person changes. It is me, or perhaps us, who are in danger of becoming petrified. Now I'm going to go slightly switch gears now by looking at two other more counterpoints, both of which shows how it can be a place where gardens can be placed that can address things such as gender, erotic tenderness, and love. This work is by an artist called Liu Rushi, a women artist, a female artist, a woman artist. As with so many women artists in Chinese art history, we know very little about them. Usually we only know them by their surname. They're known as a daughter of a wife or so-and-so. Liu was a famous courtesan, and as such, we have more anecdotal stories about her. The best being how she dressed up as a man in order to meet a celebrated scholar, Qian Qianyi, because she wanted to become his student. The following year, she became his concubine. This is a story of a brazen act that also contributed to her reputation as a scholarly woman, but it's also one that legitimizes her later achievements as someone who became a literary partner to her husband. This was a woman who was able to meet men on their territories, and it's this that might explain one of the words that you're seeing on the screen. This is a radical piece of artwork because it is not the type of work one expects from a woman artist. Literary women painted flowers or butterflies, not a scholar's garden. Here she's not only depicted a garden as how a man would have depicted it, but in a style associated with a leading Suzhou artist, none other than Wen Zhenming himself, who we saw earlier. This is, in other words, an artistic cross-dressing, where a female artist deliberately paints in a way that disguises her gender and her performance as a male artist. This may seem quite radical, and think again, this is, again, we're talking about 17th century. We're not talking about contemporary practice here. We're talking about 17th century China. And it was not quite such an unusual practice because it was usually seen amongst other courtesan women artists competing in a highly competitive world of courtesans. But it also shows how cross-dressing through the language of art was a way that exposes the inclusivity of the male world of art making. I'm going to show another example of how the image of the garden was used as a counterpoint to the usual expressions of highbrow intellectual engagement of the idealized male scholars in these two works. And this is between a teacher and his devoted student. And just think back to what I was saying, how important gardens were, especially when it came to with men as a place of friendship, but friendship of scholarly types, of scholarly engagement and elite art. This is something which is the opposite. This small album leaf painted by Jingnong, the teacher, is an intimate work showing the back of a figure looking out at a garden pond full of lotus flowers. The inscription in one of the lines says, "Us sitting together, your delicate hands peeling the lotus seeds for me." Lotus flowers often carry erotic undertones, and Jingnong was known for his love affairs with young men. The depiction of queer intimacy is not unusual in literature, but in art, it was slightly more rare because there wasn't a ready vocabulary for this type of intimate expression between men. This is a painting of a memory of a former tryst, of Jingnong with a former lover. And its intimate declaration of affection is again transgressive, not least for its nostalgic tenderness. Placing the figures at the bottom of the figure, standing over this covered walkways, allows this abstract blots of lotus flowers and leaves to dominate the scene, as if we as viewers are supposed to share the memory of these two lovers. Now, if Jin's painting is a daring display of intimacy, his student's painting of the same image adds yet a different layer of love. Luo Ping was one of Jin's loyal students, and in many ways, a father figure. He himself had lost his father at a young age. After his teacher's death, Luo helped with the funeral arrangements and followed rituals as if he was Jin's son. Luo was an unusual painting, and he actually made several portraits of his teacher that were also highly unusual, like this one of his teacher sleeping with his servant boy next to him, also sleeping. It is a beautiful, tender, vulnerable portrait, and really, again, very transgressive. This idea of depicting his teacher half naked in this kind of summer moment in the summer heat. And again, we have him back to back with this young boy who's a servant boy, but there's a great intimacy between these two men, both share as streaming at the same time. And in so many ways, and it goes back to what I'm saying about this idea of depicting love between two men. And this copy that we see here is no less touching. Luo Ping has made a copy of his teacher's work. While copying is often seen as an act of homage, usually of artistic talents. I'm copying someone's work because I admire that particular artist. We're doing something else is going on here, because he has chosen to copy a picture that is deeply private. And again, it's not a straightforward copy, as he's added another figure at the bottom. There's a servant here, a sign of social status, indicating that this is no longer a painting of a single person's musing, but rather he is copying to remember his teacher, who is in this painting also in the act of remembering. It's so meta, there's so many layers and layers of what memories are. But again, also of love between a teacher, a student, a father, and a son. We never think about this when we think about classical Chinese paintings and the Confucian scholarly artists as expressing this sort of very vulnerable expression of love. I want to conclude with a series of what ifs, and this will bring perhaps what I'm talking about, perhaps more in line with the ambitions of the Triennale itself. And I'm going to do this by taking a greater leap. I'm just going to ask a series of questions. Let me ask, what if we are to see these works not as marginal accounts against a dominant discourse, but part of a rich tapestry of artistic expression that has always existed side by side and equal in hierarchical status? What if the unruly desires of these paintings say less about what they're about the makers, but more how they troubled the way we today continue to neatly package Chinese past, especially when it provides an easy way, something universally understandable, to frame the present? What if we take the works of artists by focusing on the art first, rather than approach Chinese, and you can apply this to any other areas dumped under the category of non-Western art history, with methods that focus more on cultural understandings, and art is used as an example of these cultural understandings? What if we stop trying to define Chinese culture and Chinese art as being one and the same? How does this tradition give way to a modern that is not about progress, or is about progress? What then happens to the term we banter too often of non-Western art and call it out for the racism it endorses? Perhaps we start by reckoning our own complicity in reinforcing narrative of exclusion. But it must be more than a case of self-criticality or the diversification of historical subjects. And I don't think mapping global and translocal is enough. Perhaps it is time to reach out to those in other fields, perhaps of someone like me crossing from 16th century to the contemporary, of other times and other spaces. So perhaps looking at Ming and Qing gardens is not so eccentric after all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koon. It's such a such an insightful sharing. And among all, one of the things that really hit me was the artistic cross-dressing and how women artists were resisting and trying to navigate their wall in this patriarchal spaces.
Yeah, we can talk about more about that later. It's fascinating. Cross-dressing, artistic cross-dressing is fascinating.
Yeah, I'd love to. So we'll come back to it again at the end after our speakers. And it is the right time to address our next speaker, Tenzing Hao. Welcome, Tenzing Hao. So quickly introducing Zi Hao. Um, he's an artist, researcher, writer, and educator. His idea has taken shape across a diverse range of works involving language, politics, interpretive etymology, mythical chimeras, and organic assemblies. He's been published in Indonesia and Malaya World, Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, and IIAS, International Institute for Asian Studies newsletter, among many others. Zi Hao, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Shasha. I'll just share my screen. Can you see it? All right. So the presentation that I'll be giving is based upon a work that I did in 2016 called The Skeleton of Makara, The Myth of a Myth. The main concern is that I'm trying to imagine what is it like to think about a skeletal structure of a mythical animal. Makara is generally a creature that is composed of elephant, crocodiles, and depending on regional variation, some would include tails of peacock or a fish fin. So generally, what I'm interested in exploring in this work, Skeleton of Makara, is that that a lot of understanding about mythical animals, in particular chimeric creatures, despite their widespread appearance in Southeast Asia, East Asia, or South Asia, they seem to appear in different names, in different manifestations. And as a result of that, right, it's also because of methodological nationalism that have encouraged different localities to reclaim these creatures as their own. Even in places like Myanmar, parts of Myanmar, you have political parties who would use a similar creature, which is known as Pinsia Rupa or five form, as their party emblem. Whereas in the other part of Myanmar, you also have another one claiming that it is not five form, it's nine form, so it's Nawa Rupa. But regardless of these different creatures bearing different names, there is a certain template that I feel can be read as a trope across Asia, and one could even argue later on even beyond Asia, and which is the Makara as a template, right? The way we think about hybrid imagination, how that creates a template for us to think about, to basically include different ideas and to represent it in a singular whole. So when I'm presenting this work in the form of a skeleton, I'm thinking also about the fragmentary idea of the creature, as well as how history about mythology is often fossilized. And sometimes it's the fragments or the absences of these skeletons that matter. So one of the earliest manifestation of Makara you can see here is actually, you can see that it is an elephant head that terminates with the tail that looks like a serpentine tail. And on the elbow, there's a fish fin. Now, what is interesting about this particular image is that you can see that the elephant trunk is holding a garland. Now, most of the time, the Makara has some kind of connotation with the Capricorn. And this is particularly the case when it comes to, say, if we look into Roman Empire, where they talked about where there's an association of Capricorn and cornucopia, which is the horn of plenty. So Makara in places like India, it symbolizes fertility, abundance. Similarly, in the ancient Roman Empire, you can see that the use of Capricorn is often with cornucopia, has the same symbolic significance. And in Hindu temples, if you pay attention to the ceilings, sometimes they're also portrayed Makara, but it's actually Capricorn, right? Because in this Hindu astrology, so both Capricorn and Makara is actually synonymous. And what is interesting about these political use of Makara, especially in the case of the Roman Empire, is that the when Makara is used as a symbol for an empire or Capricorn, it basically denotes dominion over aquatic as well as terrestrial territories. And bear in mind that a lot of these chimeric creatures, chimeric representation is often a combination of animals from land, water, as well as creatures from the sky. So celestial, aquatic, and terrestrial animals. So it's by telescoping all these creatures into one that kingdoms, ancient kingdoms, and kings are able to represent their power, yeah, across different territories. So around the 5th, 6th centuries, Makara has sort of evolved into a different form, becoming a steed. So you can see that in Hindu mythologies, in Hinduism, Buddhist Hinduism, you can find that Makara has become this beast of burden, usually carrying Hindu deities such as Varuna and Ganga, which is basically goddess that are affiliated with the symbol of water or fertility. Now, the position of Makara is usually located at the bottom. That is because of their chthonic association. On this particular picture, what you see is a archway, a torana, that is a combination of Kala and Makara. And in this combination, it is usually located in liminal spaces. Yeah, because this Kala Makara torana is the entrance, it marks the entrance of the building, and it's usually located at the upper galleries. So when Buddhist initiates enter into this building, into this monument, this Buddhist monument, perhaps one could see it as a symbolic entry into the path of enlightenment. And not only that, Kala usually is understood as a symbol of time. And we know that time is the devourer of all things. So it swallows everything. So this can also become a symbol of the cycle of life and death. Now, at the moment, it seems that Makara is often understood as a symbol of Hindu and Buddhist, but in some of the Islamic artifacts, especially this one, processional standard, or called alam, we can also find elements that resemble Makara. And when they are depicted on processional standard, in this case, it's in Deccan in 17th to 18th centuries, which is also available in Hyderabad in India, and also prevalent in Safavid Iran. They're also seen as a symbol, a liminal symbol for things that travel between life and death. So in this case, it's a symbol that they use to parade during the celebration of Muharram. Now in Southeast Asia, Makara has a very different manifestation. So instead of being placed onto these weapons, you can still find them in some of these monuments. And what you can't find in other parts of the world, but unique to Southeast Asia, is that they are often being rendered in a floral motif. So it's highly stylized. So to the untrained eyes, one might not even find that there is actually a Makara kind of hidden in some of these locations. So here is actually a miniaturized form of the Kala Makara Torana. And in this stylized form, one could see that there's kind of like life forms ejecting out of the Makara to the point that it remains hidden to the point of abstraction. Now, many people would tend to interpret this stylization of Makara as a influence of Islam, because in Islam, you can't portray figurative work. It can only have geometric abstraction, but it's not always the case, as you can see in the earliest some of these examples, right? Islamic art have makaras, has animal figures, and pre-Islamic art forms as well do have stylization of makaras even before Islam became a popular religion. So in this instance, this is actually an image of a shadow puppet called Gunungan. You can see that the shadow puppet is actually flanked by a pair of makaras. This is a close-up image of the makara. And in some instances, they are highly abstracted and they become some sort of floral motif again, indicating life forms ejecting out from the center. The gunungan is a mountain. Gunung is a mountain, but it's also a kind of tree of life. So it's usually presented at the beginning or at the end or as an intermission of the play. This is also another example of stylization that has really entirely enveloped the creature. So as you can see, the eye of the Makara can still be quite prevalent. There is the center over here, but the entire form of Makara has almost disappeared. But people who are well versed with this Makara as a motif will immediately notice that the keris hilt, or in this case, it's a klewang hilt. Now, weapons often contain an image of Makara, but in a foliated form. Now, what I think that Makara has become so stylized is precisely because of this idea that it represents an infinite cycle of life and death, right? So we're going back to the idea that Makara could potentially symbolize fecundity, fertility, but at the same time, in the Kala Makara Torana, it symbolizes both life and death. And in fact, if we look at these Mon Makara balustrade, what we are seeing here, and this is a motif that's very prevalent throughout Siamese temple, that you can find decorating the stairs are basically Makaras devouring or even ejecting another Makara, devouring another forms of life. In this case, it is Mon, which is a mythical lizard. So what is interesting about this picture is that we could never be sure whether the Makara is actually swallowing or ejecting life. Yeah, so this, again, the ambiguity of life and death in the motif of Makara. And on the left, you can see that there's a caption, and there it says, time devours everything along with itself. Yeah, so the time here is actually Kala, but in this case, Kala, which you saw in the picture of Borobudur's Torana, is no longer here. So to some extent, Makara itself encapsulates the very idea of life and death. And there's also, according to a local account, a Buddhist monk actually said that this decoration reminds people to be humble, because there's always this possibility that even a creature as powerful as Mon or as powerful as Naga could potentially be swallowed by a Makara. You can see other examples as well. Makara ejecting life forms, or is it swallowing life forms? In this case, it's swallowing a three-headed Naga. And it is this idea that within the body of Makara containing a multiplicity of life forms that I find particularly interesting, that there is some kind of anarchic intensities that we can locate within the subjectivity of Makara in the water sprouts in Nepal, or is it the powder flask that we can find in many Mughal artifacts? There's always this tendency where different animals are being ejected out of Makara. So as a template, it provides this creative energy or creative platforms for different artists to play with compositions and chimeric imagination. Now, apart from that, as I mentioned earlier, that in Southeast Asia, some of these creatures are no longer called Makara, but they are named differently. So in this case, it's Paksinagaliman. But as you can see, the shape itself is quite, it resembles the idea of Makara in that there is always an elephant. There's always, it's always with a tusk. And the name of this creature, Paksinagaliman, represents, in Japanese, phoenix, dragon or serpent, and elephant. So it's a combination of aquatic, terrestrial, and celestial animals. Meaning, again, when the kings or the prince are riding on top of these carriage, what that basically means is that they have certain power over these creatures. So it kind of goes back to the idea of taming the beast. And not only that, by riding on top of these creatures are able to transport the kings, the sultans, or whatsoever to any kinds of cosmic or territorial, across different cosmic or territorial boundaries. So when I was working on these installation, the skeleton of Makara, which was installed in Singapore, I'm also thinking about Singapore as a site-specific field. And in this case, of course, a hybrid representation, a chimeric form, is none other than the Merlion. Now, we often think of Merlion as a modern symbol that is detached of its history, and the Merlion as a combination of lion and fish is usually seen as a progressivist outlook, in that when the government first conceived of it, it thinks of Singapore as evolving from a fishing village to a roaring lion city, right? So it combines the old as well as the new. It combines the fish that represents the old, and the fish also means, to some extent, indicating the Malay word temasek, the Javanese word temasek, meaning lake, and Singapura, meaning the lion city. So it's lion and fish, the old and the new, village and city. So by that very chimeric representation, we can see that there is a developmentalist or a progressivist historical outlook within the chimeric representation of the Merlion. Now, what is the relationship between the Merlion and Makara? Now, if we look deeper into some of these articles that has been published, there have been discussions about the resemblances between the Merlion and Makara. In 1999, someone made this speculation that if Makara was symbolic of protection, similarly, we can find something that resembles this trait in the Merlion. In this case, the article speculates that you can actually see the designer of the Merlion statue was inspired by a Makara statue that was first found in Malacca. The designer of that statue was actually also from Malacca. The designer of the Merlion was not from Malacca, but the designer of the Merlion statue was from Malacca. And in one of the incidents, one of the accounts claimed that it was precisely the fact that when the Makara statue was found in Malacca, it was facing the river of Malacca. And it was that moment that inspired the designer to think about having an icon as also a chimeric creature that is facing the sea. In this case, in Singapore, the Merlion statue is always facing the sea, and also always regurgitating. There's this infinite amount, flows of water, streams of water that kind of will be flushed out of its mouth. And then if we come to think of this idea that in post-colonial Singapore, it is the hybridity of lion and fish that gives us this theological idea about a state being progressive and modern. I become interested then to see chimeric representation as a platform for post-colonial politics. And of late, right, there's this renewed interest about the Loting figure, which is actually a mermaid-like figure. And there was exhibition organized around it during the transition period. So in 1998, there was this Loting exhibition, and artworks were created around it, thinking about the idea of Hong Kong cultural identity being stuck, kind of caught in between, or the uncertainty of one's cultural identity. And that was expressed through this hybrid figure called the Loting. And I think we can find something similar between the Merlion and Loting. If we begin to see that in post-colonial subjectivities, there's often this struggle of identities, struggle of essence, and chimerical representation often provides that unique template to wrestle with whether it's spatial or temporal kind of ontological ideas about what constitutes essence. And also, of course, in popular culture, the idea of Loting was also recently being mentioned in this movie called The Mermaid by Stephen Chow. And what is interesting is that in this movie, there's a sequence involving a character asking, actually lodging a police report that he stumbled upon a mermaid and he wanted to lodge a police report, but the policeman couldn't seem to understand that there is such a thing called mermaid. So he's trying to provide an accurate sketch of that mermaid based on the description provided by the witness. But there's often this inability to think or to imagine this idea of a hybrid creature that can be one, right? And I think what is interesting in this scene is also that when the policeman lifts up the paper, that paper is also kind of concealing the emblem, the state emblem behind that is symbolic of the Chinese state. So perhaps we can see again the chimeric representation as always becoming this platform to question something that is unthinkable, unimaginable. In this case, it's one country, two system. So to go back to this idea, kind of to conclude, is that I find that by the moment we think about the skeleton of Makara, again, it's about using chimerical representation as a way of questioning national territorial boundaries that have appeared to be rather fossilized, especially in the age of very xenophobic and where we have a lot of nationalistic sentiments kind of emerging as a result of globalization. So seeing these skeletal structures and thinking about these absences, fragmentary nature of a skeleton, and also thinking about the skeleton, the fossil as a scientific evidence for that which does not exist. And that is what I'm interested to prop in this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Zi Hao. It's really interesting, like how you have interpreted the existence of Makara around the region, and how you've connected all those dots throughout the histories to the point, and how it is related to contemporary politics also, and how people institutionalize religions, different communities, individuals, and nation state, and also pop cultures have adopted, interpreted, and reinterpreted it in their own ways. And I think it's such a nice time to transit to Sedon. And I'd like to introduce Sedon. Tenzing Sedon Ukyab is a graduate from SUNY New Plage with a degree in art and public relation, with a family background in antiques, and her long-standing interest in Himalayan art has led her to work with various creative communities and organizations such as Rubin Museum of Art, Tibet Museum, Magic, and various collectives, art studios, etc. In 2021, she co-founded Jiva Space, an online art initiative that highlights perspective on arts and cultures of these regions. Currently, she's working as a curatorial assistant for Kathmandu Triennale. And she is passionate about Himalayan contemporary arts and antiques, and is collaboratively working with various artists in the art world. Born in Nepal, Sedon's education and experience span across Nepal, India, China, and USA. Welcome, Sedon.
Hi, okay, I'm just gonna share my screen. So I think a lot of what I am questioning, what of my presentation is more of questions that I'm posing, and it's not as a solid research as but more of like encounters and ways that I'm navigating our family's connection with dealing in antiquities for over the past 40 years. So beginning we are actually from Molung. My father's hometown is from Molung, which is on the border of Nepal, Tibet, China. And then, so this is the village that is, he's actually from. So my father actually grew up and was a horse. He actually traded horses in the borders, and over time, he was able to get in and collect more of the over time, he actually started collecting antiquities around the time when China was coming out of Cultural Revolution, and there was this opportunity in Tibet and Lhasa where there was a lot of antiquities that would be sold in bulk, and I think a lot of the established antique collectors in the Himalayan region actually collected the antiques around that time. So this is around the time when we actually, my father and our family moved from from Wolong to Hile, then to Kathmandu. And then where we established our shop, which is now almost 34 years old. So moving forward, I think just want to talk a bit about the geography and how like the plateau is divided into three major parts, which is the Utsang, Kham, and Amdo. I think this is very important when we are looking at furniture, because although in Kham, furniture was abundant, in Utsang, you would find it would be very hard to find wood. So it was always so wood was seen as a prized possession. And so going to the brief furniture history that we have, then actually the earliest origination is probably, they say, is the gam, or the box, which was later then replaced by the cabinets, or chagam, which became popular in Tibet around the 18th century and continues to be in demand. Even today, compared to the other traditional furniture pieces beside the altar or trushum and the folding tables or chokse, that's called in Tibetan, it was the 17th century that saw the peak in painted furniture decoration. At that time, craftsmen from all over Tibet, Nepal, and Han were employed to make boxes. The shape of the storage box was simple, with colorful paintings and functional metal decorations, which gave it a unique aesthetic native to the Tibetan plateau. So moving forward, I think what I wanted to talk about is like highlight some some of the furnitures that are actually in our collection. What you see on the left is actually a torgam, which was used to store tormas, which is usually used for puja, or let's say for sacred ceremonies. And then usually it happens around the New Year's, and what they do is they're made of dough and they're kept in these tantric torgams. That's what it's called. And so if you look at closely at the torgams, you would see a lot of animals being represented there. We have the tiger, the leopard, we have the Tibetan mastiff, I would say it's here around here, and we have the snow lion. So usually the torgams were tantric treaties. This one is for the Mahakala or Bhairav, I believe. And so it was associated, and also it's an interesting question, because when I was going through the torgams, we have like questions about animal depictions in Tibetan furniture art, where you would see quite a lot of variations, because I remember a conversation that I was having with my father, where elephants are actually not native to the plateau. And so how did one imagine it, and how did it come across, and how did people draw it? And it's such an interesting aspect, because they were saying that earlier images of the elephant were actually quite different, and then over time they actually changed that. And so what we also have is like specific boxes, like the one below is called it's the face of Kirtimuka. It's Kirtimuka, or in Tibetan we call it Zipak or Ziba, and in Nepali we call it Chepu. So this is something you would probably see on the Toranas of the temples in Nepal or in India, and it's also something that is quite commonly found in Tibetan furnitures, because they are a protector deity. So, and the one above is actually a depiction of a mongoose, which is actually related to the god of wealth, Jambala, or the Kuber. And these images that are, or icons that are on these boxes, also specify the use of these furnitures. So I think these are more related to keeping off or keeping off of religious items per se over time. Moving forward, one interesting encounter I had, or conversation I had with my father, was about the Russian box. This is what I call it. It's called the Russian box for me, because while in conversation, my father was like, this is actually, these kind of boxes were actually made in Russia and then transported to the Tibetan market for trade, because you wouldn't find such works in the Tibetan market. And so they were actually transported from Russia. And so this is made of leather, and it has like a textile piece embroidered in between, shows a picture of a garden. What really also was a topic that was fascinating to me while going through the collection that we have is the depiction of tigers. And sometimes I find very realistic images of tigers on these boxes, and while they are really realistic, we also find really abstract boxes or images or exploration of such. And while going through that, the box on the top where you see is actually probably inspired by musical notations, Tibetan musical notations that were written. And so the flow is designed as such, but it is a tiger print. And so you also see that quite a lot in Tibetan carpets. And so these are questions that really interested me, because a lot of times we always think of Tibetan art as religious, but I think there were exploration. They were actually exploring, I think, within their own limitations, I think, non-religious, but abstract things within their own art forms. Like I would say that right now in Tibetan furniture, this is the chagam. So this was the later edition of furnitures that we have. That's the cabinets. And this cabinet in particular shows seasonal changes. And so if you go here, you can see the flower gradually withering to going to full bloom, to blooming, to the copula seeds. So it shows the life of a flower, which is depicted on the cabinet. Another depiction we have is the chagam, which now is showing how the flowers are gradually dying. It isn't in any particular order, but if you look closely, you can see the variations of the withering plants or the budding and the withering going on as each panel is different. And so moving forward, I also encounter so the process is actually a lot of questioning, because there is quite a lot that it's very limited what is being written about, I would say, Tibetan furniture, but there's quite a lot of material that talks about so many aspects of culture and art that was being explored during that time. And so these are some of the wooden panels we had in our collection, but sadly now we don't, where I was exploring the first one is called a Namkai Ningbo, which is interesting because it was the first time I saw an altar. This is actually an altar with a headboard of a monk, which I think is very rare. And so when I explored it, it turned out to be one of the 29 disciples of Padmasambhava. And so these are interesting questions, I think, to be explored as to where these altars used. And these are the questions that I've been posing. The other panels that you see, the first one is Nagarjuna, and the second one is Dharmakirti, and the third is Arya Deva. So these three panels are actually taken from the 6 ornaments and the 2 supreme panels, which kind of was depicted quite a lot. That's what I've on like wooden panels. But I haven't seen them on modern furnitures per se, being recreated as such. So, so another interesting encounter I had was with these really small leather plates that we had that actually had marked who the owner was and which family owned it and what year it was made. Um, I had consulted with King Tashitsringla, who is from Amni Marchand Institute, and he was very kind enough to kind of give me more information and background as to what the letter plate, what was marked in the letter plate. So so these leather plates are called derma or tapak, and they are made out of tanned leather material. The term tapak is borrowed from Turkic or Mongolia verna, and on the back, what is actually marked on the plate is dokar chuta, chuta sarzu. So it's actually dokar is a family name, or ragashar, which is actually a Kuta family. Kuta is how would you, aristocrat family belonging to Tibet, and from central Tibet, it is dated to be chu is water and ta is horse. So water horse here, which could possibly be the 16 or the 17, 1642 or the 1702 here of the dates. The script is actually written in Drutsa style, which is also Tibetan calligraphic style, which is artistic in nature. The small leather plates such as these were actually used for rituals and offerings at altars. So yeah, moving forward. I think what I wanted to kind of come down to is actually a script that I wrote, kind of talking about the kind of conversations me and my father have regarding the antiques, because I think there is so much of a generational gap that we have within us, and also language barriers per se, that it does make it difficult to sometimes pass that knowledge down as someone who will inherit the business one day. And so I think this is a script that I had written regarding a conversation I was having with my dad about a Tibetan folding table, which actually turned out to be inspired. The drawings on the Tibetan, or the paintings on the Tibetan folding table turned out to be inspired from the tin biscuit boxes that used to come from India. And so for me, that was really surprising, because at that time when I initially had come and I was asking all these questions, I did not realize, I was limiting myself also to thinking that Tibetan furniture depicted more of religious, mainly religious significance, or had religious motifs on it. But also the tension that happens, between, while having these conversations where, when I say, oh, the artist is anonymous, and then we have like these terminologies that we don't have a translation per se, how to describe it in Tibetan, and it's this very interesting. I don't. It's this very common way, I think, now, how a generation gap tends to understand and grasp things, but also there's a lot of I would say, like, different priorities, I think, because I think when I went to the West and came back, I had just learned to have an opinion, because a lot of the times while I was studying in India, I was not it was very limited to what I could say, or what I could see. The education in itself really did not let me have an opinion. So when I did have an opportunity to go study, and when I studied about post-colonization, and I had been, then I was talking about all of these theories and understanding the importance of representation and inclusive dialogue. And I'd come back to Nepal, and these were the conversations we were having, where there was like, when I was trying to talk to my father about, oh, it is important, to have these kind of dialogues to be having, but all he could say was like, why don't you first improve your Tibetan, which is there, but I think it's this very this nuanced like talk that we have in these conversations, where we learn also, but there's so much of personal connection and history, and so it is a challenge, as sometimes. So moving forward, I think I just wanted to end with a few of the questions that I had, and also actually from listening to Dr. Koon and Zi Hao, I was thinking about how my dad is a collector, and I think on a connoisseur, I believe, and I think he has reached a point where I think he can't help but collect. And also the fact that how the furniture in itself, like the garden, is where sacred objects or living objects are kept and stored, and that connection I thought was very interesting while I was hearing Dr. Koon's presentation, and these are the questions that these are the approaches I think I'm taking, or the questions I've been asking, is about taste and about development of taste and the trained eye. Because while coming back to Nepal, I kind of noticed more of the community, the antique community that is here and has been established for quite a long time, and how they look at objects, how they evaluate objects, and how they also know what object is old or which is fake. And I think these are things that they have developed out of experience over the years of having to deal with, or having been dealing with antiques for so long. And so I think these are the questions that I'm hoping to approach as to how one does it. And also questions about like, a lot of times also there's perspectives within the local community about collectors, whereas how they view Western collectors to how they view local collectors, and also about whose taste at a local level are the museums acquiring, further down. And so these, these are some of the questions that I've been approaching in the past 2 years that I have been back home, and spending more time with the community here, and in Lhasa while I'm there, and asking these questions. Because what I find is like how each connoisseur is dealing or collecting or having a certain taste really also defines how their collection is. And I think that's been a very interesting observation I've made, because I've met a collector who collects only masks, and has a huge collection of masks. And I have met a collector who's very interested in textile, and so he buys all these rags or old pieces of old textiles to fix his textile collection. And so the process has been very interesting. There's still a lot more work to be done, definitely, but I think these are more of the questions, and I've been questioning the kind of approaches and how to view or learn more about this aspect that is happening within our community. I guess that is where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Sedon. And also, like, it's really interesting how you connected the dots with Dr. Koon's sharings. And I was also in fact reflecting similar thing of how the understanding and interpretation and expectation of what collector is has also sort of changed post-colonization, and it's not the idea of collection in itself is not a contemporary thing or modern and contemporary thing, but it has its own kind of history, which is definitely not discussed. And also, I was also reflecting on the kind of the history of object itself, and also kind of motifs which is represented in it, and how Himalayan communities have been projected as such a isolated little like kingdoms and communities, whereas where it was fluid forever and exchanges happened like since forever. Thank you. So I'd like to open the floor if for the audience, people who are listening, if you have any questions, but also the speakers, if you want to express or comment on each other or just share more, you're welcome to do that.
I have a couple of things I would like to share, or ask actually more questions. And Sedon, I was really interested in the Russian box, and I was wondering who would be, and you were saying that they were being moved to Tibet. And so that it suggests that there's a market for these things. So who was buying these things? And in particular, I'm just thinking about that incredible, intense relationship between Russia and Tibet at this moment in time. So who was buying these boxes, these Russian boxes?
These were actually in the aristocratic families or would go in the palaces, because they were harder to acquire. And so I think wooden furniture was also seen as status. So I think the main people who were actually acquiring them were the aristocrats or the richer monasteries or things like that.
Thank you. I also had a question for Zi Hao as well about it was so interesting how you were using the chimera as this template, right? But at the same time, the monster, and I was kind of interested in the ones that are monsters or monstrous, and the ones that are not, and how that fit into nationalist arguments or non-nationalist arguments, and how did that work? Because the Merlion, it's in some ways almost a taming of monstrosity, right? And whereas others are much allowing that monstrosity of because that's the point of chimera. It's about the hybridity of monsters. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I think in parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia, they do not necessarily see this hybridity as monstrous. So maybe there's another character that's called monsters, like ogres. So the Raksasa. So the Raksasas, they are monstrous, but not these creatures. So despite the fact that they are chimerical, they have never been described, to my understanding, in manuscripts, in chronicles, to my understanding, they have not been described as monstrous. They have appeared in dreams, usually like a Deus Ex Machina, to kind of, you dream about these creatures, and then something happened as a result of that.
Oh, interesting. It's interesting because I was also thinking about sea creatures and maps, and how they would often have monsters. It was just that there's a whole world with maritime life that is also part of this. And I was wondering whether there is all of this mapping that you're doing, whether being islands or certain types of islands also kind of produce these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when it comes to mapping, considering the fact that mapping exercises from the West, these unknown regions are usually depicted, they have illustrations of monsters in unknown regions. Yeah. So things that appears to be kind of unknown, then that monsters becomes that index for the wild.
Because I was there in China, so in Beijing, during the Mongolian period, when they were building a palace, they also had a lot of these. I mean, I'm calling them monsters, but I don't mean them in a monstrous Western sense of words. I just mean these creatures, but they often had them too. Because there was this idea of the power of of wilderness, right? And it's about so much about state power. It was also about taming the wilderness as well.
Mm. Yeah, well, actually, there is a book by David Munro, an archaeologist, who talks about the origin of monsters. And actually his understanding is that even during Egyptian and Mesopotamian times, if you look at some of the stamps, Harappan stamps, the complexity of a creature evolved according to the complexity of cities. So there seems to be some correlation, according to his argument, some correlation between bureaucratic administration, bureaucratization of a state, vis-a-vis the depiction of chimeric representation. So chimeras become this symbol to unite divergent or cosmopolitan elements in the city.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. If you have any questions and comments to each other.
I actually also wanted to add how it's interesting because I did not notice if I've ever seen a Makara painted on a box or a furniture. And I think this just raised some really interesting questions as to, because we do see the Garuda or the Kyung, and we do see quite a lot of the Kirti Mukha, which usually complements, is the Makara, which is usually shown together in most of Tronas. But I haven't seen I've seen quite a lot of animals and creatures, but not the Makara per se. And I think this is something interesting that maybe I'll look into as to maybe why. Is it because Tibet was landlocked, or I don't know. I think this is something that would be interesting to also think about. Yeah.
But you were showing Kritimuka, right? So is that very common?
Yeah, it is quite common. Yeah, especially on boxes. So that was interesting. Yeah.
Dr. Koon, coming back to our interesting talk that we discussed, the point from you about how 17th century women from 17th century were kind of the term you used is also very fascinating, artistic cross-dressing. You're not saying camouflage, or you're not using other words, but that specific phrase. But also I was interested in understanding these women's status, and then how and the titles and their names, and then and their existence overall at that time, and then later on how it was discussed by the art historians.
It's kind of really interesting because women artists really become much more visible at this moment in time. And it's partly just to do with the rise of urban cultures. There's more art being made, and one of the key things was that cities became, for the first time, places of cultural centers, as opposed to just capitals, which is kind of what was happening before. And this kind of created a greater diversity. But another part of it had to do with tax changes in tax system, where previously one had to pay taxes in terms of cotton and in rice. So now at this moment in time, you can pay in money, which essentially freed up a lot of women from certain types of jobs. And that was very important too. So there were all these other different things. So the rise of cities, this idea of diversity of different buyers and markets. And so they found a place where women could create art and make art as a living. I mean, women have always been artists if they were part of a family workshop. They've just never been recognized within it. So that's why they were always daughter of so-and-so's. And it's still true actually up to quite 19th and 20th century, before women really come through and become these much more we get much more individual biographies of these people in the 18th and 19th century. So it's quite late, as it were. I use the term cross-dressing in particular because there is a kind of performance to it. It is connected very much. Mulan is actually a very famous story of someone, and cross-dressing was one of the terms that's kind of traditionally used in this idea of performance. And there's a kind of theatricality and a self-awareness in their performativity. And that's kind of the reason why I chose that as opposed to thinking about camouflage, because in some ways they want people to be aware of the fact that there are doing what they're doing. They're very self-aware of it. And this also can be something which is, they're doing just in many ways an outer. They're not in itself are performing, they're not in themselves trying to play with gender at a much deeper level. It really is much more as a performance level, and in the art in particular, because it was a one way for a lot of courtesans. It was a very difficult trade. And if you had a reputation as being this person who is able to in some ways compete with men, and not just in terms of I can paint in a men's style, but I am actually academically or in literature and history, I can be as good as any man. That's when you would do it. That's when you will cross-dress artistically. It can't just be one without the other. And so that's kind of the thing that's actually happening. What is really interesting in the 18th and 19th, in this particular period, is that women become students and of male scholars, and these male scholars started collecting groups of female students, and then they started publishing women's work. And so that's when it's only without publications, without text, we wouldn't have any idea about these women. So it's actually much more their ability as text-driven people than actually in the art world itself. But increasingly, you do see women claiming more of a place. And that's actually kind of an interesting history. But it will take a long time before that will happen, partly just because paintings, the idea of an artist is so deeply rooted in this idea of the hero artist, the male artist, because it's all connected to how one, because it wasn't just that the male artist wasn't just an artist, he was also a scholar. He was also someone who would become a servant of the state. It wasn't, he never just played one role, he played many roles, and that's what made him the ideal artist. And women can't compete with that. Women didn't belong in those ways. And so it took a long time until people started questioning what is the ideal artist and taking that hero down from its pedestal. Women will never have a place, a visibility within the art historical text. It's still really difficult to do an art history of this particular period because there's so little written about it. And there's so little that we know anything. It can take decades before we can find out a name of what the real name of the artist is. Because before, I mean, this artist I was talking about, she actually went by another name called Zhang Ai. We never knew it was the same person until relatively recent. So it's very hard. It's a very hard story to recover, but it is being done, but it's incredibly difficult.
I have a question for Koon as well. You mentioned earlier that there is this small snippet of story about someone was seeing something and then he became petrified, right? Turns into a rock. So are they similar narratives surrounding that? I'm asking because I have come across similar stories in Malay chronicles, and when that happened is that they were engaging in some kind of impulsive activities, something to do with sexual instincts, so or even violence. So the petrification come as a result of punishment of that passion, and the petrification I would see as a process of hardening things that would are usually liquid. So I wonder what are the other narratives that
the petrification emotions is a really hard, because this again, the visibility of women is also connected, of women artists is also a growing interest in this idea, and people talking about emotions, Qing. But emotions isn't the way that we think of emotions, like anger, sorrow, all of those things. So these things became much more, people started talking about them much more, and obsession becomes part of that story, this idea of emotional state. And in some ways, if we were to put it into contemporary art, it's a study of affect. And it's about that moment in some ways before emotions is expressed. So in other words, tears itself is not necessarily unhappiness, they're just tears. It's that moment before the tears happen, that's affect, and that's Qing in some ways. Is that strong welling up, the potential of emotion is what is Qing. And that's what, in some ways, a lot of these the idea of petrification comes in as well. It's about that potential to become petrified is actually what is of interest. It's that ability to transmute, right? It doesn't really necessarily have to come from, obsession isn't necessarily something which is negative. It has the potential to be negative, so one need to control it. And the one of the woman turning into stone was that she just loved her husband to a point that she couldn't carry out her duties. And so as a result of that, it was an obsession. She herself becomes petrified. But it's really to do with the petrification of the stone is really much more to do with obsession. You don't really have it with any other kind of emotions in the same way. There is, and the reason for that is it's because its origins is a disease, and it's a disease that's similar to gallbladders. I don't know gallbladder, gallstones. I think that's what it is, but I'm not really sure. I need a medical person to tell me what's the thing that gets stuck in your left rib. But it is only specifically about disease, and a disease is not necessarily of liquid form, but to do with different forms of energy that shouldn't belong together and come together. So the cold with the heat that isn't mixing right is what is kind of what is the disruption of your chi is what causes disease. So it's not liquids itself. It's much more to do with energy. I mean, but I should say I am not a medical tech doctor, and 17th century medical texts are very different from reading to paintings. But it's fun. I mean, it's kind of interesting for me. What I was really interested in when thinking about obsession, not only how we think about collectors and what does this mean by how we justify it, but because there's always this complicated thing between art worlds and the art market, and how those were being navigated at different moments in time. And that's also with the women dressing, cross-dressing is also a kind of a navigation of these social complexities. And that's kind of what I was really interested in. But also once we start thinking about it in that way, how do we now, I mean, how many times do you look at a contemporary or a modern Chinese art show and they're talking about the past as this simple, very simple heroic way? And that's what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in two things. I'm interested in that historical narrative in the 16th and 18th century, and how to think about these dynamics of history going on at the same time. But I'm also interested in how today we look at that past, and how in many ways we especially because we need to talk more globally, we can sometimes reduce things into things without even realizing we're reducing things into these stereotypes. And quite oftentimes it's the past that we reduce as opposed to the dynamics of the present. And that's why I think it's so important to remember that histories are unruly and that histories are complicated. And if we don't bring that in, we won't understand the contemporary in any kind of really meaningful way. And my big thing is like so many art historians about the decolonization of art history, which for me, part of that is it's at that moment of not understanding the past, because it is so systemic. And for me, the difference between post-colonial approaches to art history and decolonization of art history that's happening now is what we're doing. The decolonization is actually recognizing that the systemic problem of art history, which spreads in all kinds of levels, including the simple way that we treat the past. So yeah, that's my mission with everybody else.
And our solidarity in it.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah.
I'm sorry. It just resonated with what you're saying, like what exactly I've been thinking and the questions that have been coming while I'm approaching research, because I think the dialogue isn't inclusive. And what I always am contemplating and fearing is we are losing more and more of the people who actually have that knowledge or the memory of the knowledge, because now everything's become almost a memory of use, of memory of what do we call something. And so I think that's also something like I'm also like questioning quite a lot. And you exactly said what was in my mind as to how does one approach that? It's just it's so little time and it's so much work to do. I think that's, yeah, thank you so much for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all, I think I think particularly in what you're doing, that fear of loss is really, or that's the need to recover it's so different, right? And when you're looking at Chinese art, there's almost too many texts, so it's a needle in a haystack, a thing, and so that becomes overwhelming, which is in some ways very different from what you have, which is you're putting things that are spread around and trying to, and you know what you do in Zi Hao, like you're trying to make connecting points between things that don't really connect, just in order to recreate something that needs to be told that story, right? So it's just different methodologies, but I think in some ways we sort of, again, trying to just break away from, and again, not to say that, because I don't like to say that I'm working from the position of margins, because I don't think that's what I'm doing. I just think people put me in the margins. I don't particularly see what I'm in the margins, but it is a way of disrupting that sort of dominant narrative with other types of narrative that must continue as well.
So if we don't have questions anymore from the audience, I mean, you can, this is a sneak peek of what's coming up, and you can read more, understand more about our speakers in our publication, which is coming up. And I would also like to invite you all in the in-person venue openings which is happening on March 1st. But if you cannot travel, we are gonna do it in hybrid formats. So we will have curatorial tools, we will have artist interviews, we'll have 3D mapping, etc., etc. And please do join them. So if there's no last comments, then I would really like to thank you all for your precious time here.
Thank you, Dr. Koon. Thank you, Zi Hao.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.